They say empires are built by generals. But history hides a more unsettling truth. Some empires were bent, redirected, even dismantled by women whose names never appeared in any chronicle. If you're watching this right now, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, and make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because what you're about to learn has been buried for centuries. Most people never realize that behind many of history's military decisions, withdrawals, hostage exchanges, diplomatic betrayals, sudden alliances, there were women who operated without armies, without official titles, and without the luxury of being remembered. They were not spies in the cinematic sense. They did not sneak across borders, nor did they hide coded documents in their corsets. They were influence operators, social engineers of ancient and medieval politics, who controlled the flow of information between ambassadors, kings, tribal leaders, and generals. Their work shaped war, but their presence was denied by the very historians who benefited from their influence. Their battlefields were courtrooms, trading houses, royal family chambers, diplomatic banquets, religious councils, and the narrow corridors behind thrones where decisions were made before public decrees were ever written. One of the most fascinating patterns across civilizations, from Persia to Ming China, from the Roman East to medieval Europe, is that women in restricted or subordinate positions could access political spaces men could not. They overheard what was never meant to reach another ear. They formed bridges between rival court factions. They hosted informal gatherings where the real diplomatic decisions were hammered out before official meetings. And they mediated hostage negotiations, peace treaties, military exchanges, and clandestine alliances in ways that, if discovered, would have destroyed them instantly. They survived because their influence was invisible, or rather, it appeared invisible to men who underestimated the systems they controlled. The story begins not with a single woman, but with a pattern, an overlooked role present in nearly every ancient empire. Before a treaty was ever signed, there were intermediaries working behind the scenes to negotiate terms. Generals negotiating ceasefires never met alone. They always arrived with armed guards, distrust, and political baggage. So, who closed the distance? Who created the possibility of trust when armies were still sharpening their blades? Women, royal mediators, wives of diplomats, sisters of tribal leaders, mothers of princes, and sometimes even high-ranking servants became the invisible carriers of messages that could start or stop a war. They were never recorded as negotiators, because women cannot negotiate between armies, as ancient historians insisted. Yet these same historians documented treaty conditions so specific, so sensitive, that they could only have been developed through private, informal conversations. One of the earliest examples comes from the Achaemenid Empire. Persian queens and noblewomen were notorious, not for seduction, as later storytellers fantasized, but for commanding networks of informants within the harem, within the diplomatic halls, and across the empire's elite families. These networks operated as stabilization systems. They exchanged information between rival generals, preemptively preventing rebellion by sending warnings through acceptable female messengers, a euphemism used in several administrative texts. These women did not physically deliver messages. They arranged marriages, hosted banquets, managed household alliances, and leveraged gift economies to influence key men. They could redirect military decisions by altering the environment in which decisions were made. And because male officials underestimated these domestic pathways, they never bothered to regulate them. The pattern deepens as we move to the Mediterranean world. In the Roman Republic, you often hear about senators debating military strategy, but what you almost never hear is that senatorial wives were present at nearly every one of the state's unofficial political gatherings. Private dinners where rival factions tested the waters, exchanged rumors, or signaled support for military campaigns. The wives brought information from other households, from their family estates, from merchant networks, and from visiting dignitaries who underestimated a woman's memory and understanding. Several Roman historians, including last, hinted at matrone who conducted exchanges of influence beyond the knowledge of the censors. Those lines were brushed aside as moral commentary, but modern analysis suggests these women were functioning as stabilizing intelligence nodes. They did not spy, they shaped political climates. And then there are the women whose influence became so powerful it shook entire courts. One such figure emerges during the Warring States period of China Shao-ji. Modern accounts often reduce her to a tragic mother figure, but a deeper read of the records of the grand historian reveals she controlled the flow of diplomatic information that influenced Qin's military strategies. She did not hold office. She did not command soldiers. But she had access to every political player who mattered, and she maintained a network of envoys, musicians, merchants, scholars, and court officials who transmitted coded intelligence through gifts, poetry, and shared acquaintances. Her presence at negotiations was unofficial, but her influence was unavoidable. The most fascinating part is not the famous women, but the forgotten ones, the intermediaries whose names did not survive, but whose actions can be seen in the fingerprints they left on history. In medieval Spain, royal letters between Muslim and Christian leaders referenced the lady or the noblewoman who speaks for peace. In Mongol diplomacy, several princesses mediated hostage exchanges between rival tribes because male warriors refused to negotiate directly. In West Africa, the Mande epics speak of elder women whose counsel prevented blood feuds from escalating into clan wars. In the Byzantine Empire, imperial women systematically built networks of influence through religious patronage, controlling the bishops who could sway military commanders. Across all these cultures, the pattern is undeniable. Women were the silent stabilizers of political ecosystems. They prevented unnecessary wars. They secured prisoner exchanges. They manipulated ambassadors. They coordinated secret communications. They hosted gatherings where enemies broke bread for the first time. And they created the conditions under which treaties could form, conditions that generals took credit for, even though the groundwork had already been laid in the rooms they never saw. But there is a darker side, and this is where the story becomes truly gripping. The same women who prevented wars could also start them. Influence is neutral. The intention behind it determines the outcome. Some women leveraged their positions to avenge personal insults, to protect their families, or to eliminate political rivals. When they manipulated alliances, the consequences were sometimes catastrophic. A whisper at the wrong moment could shift a military campaign, redirecting thousands of lives toward death or salvation. These influence networks were not always ethical. They were powerful. Consider one of the most chilling examples from the medieval Middle East. During the Abbasid Caliphate, the royal household was a labyrinth of politics. Behind the caliph, behind his viziers, behind the military commanders, there existed a parallel chain of influence, largely controlled by elite women, concubines, mothers of princes, palace administrators, and even high-ranking servants. One such figure, her name lost to history, engineered the downfall of a military governor by manipulating the emotional loyalties of the caliph's young son. Through carefully timed stories, suggestions, and warnings, she made the prince believe the governor intended to rebel. When the prince spoke to the caliph, the man was executed, altering the balance of power across 3 provinces. The woman gained nothing personally. She was repaying an old slight against her deceased sister. Her vengeance shaped the military map of the empire. Examples like this echo across continents. A noblewoman in medieval France purposely leaked a fabricated rumor about a rival family's alliance with England. This rumor forced local lords to take sides preemptively, triggering a chain of conflicts that historians later misread as spontaneous feudal rivalries. In reality, it started with a single conversation at a winter feast. One that no chronicler thought to record in detail because it was spoken by a woman. The invisibility of these actions is what makes them so powerful in hindsight. Men controlled armies, but women controlled the social infrastructure where alliances were built or destroyed. Men marched to war, but women manipulated the negotiations that decided whether wars were fought, prolonged, or avoided. The influence networks were so delicate, so deeply embedded in personal relationships that they could not be formalized. They thrived in the spaces where men were absent: the private chambers, the domestic gatherings, the informal councils, the familial alliances, the ritual exchanges of gifts. These were the networks historians refused to see, not because they were hidden, but because historians were not present in the rooms where power was actually being exercised. And this is the core of why these women were so effective. They were underestimated. Their words were dismissed as emotional, domestic, or trivial. Yet those same words were steering the direction of political relationships between armies. Their influence operated outside the structures of official bureaucracy, so it could not be traced, regulated, or countered. They moved through spaces where men had no authority. They navigated emotional landscapes that formal diplomats could not. They detected shifts in alliances through changes in tone, body language, and family gossip long before any messenger delivered a sealed letter. As we move deeper into this story, the stakes rise, because influence networks are only as stable as the people who operate them, and history shows that these women walked on a razor's edge. A single mistake, a misplaced phrase, a wrong assumption, a betrayal by someone they trusted, could result in their execution, exile, or erasure. Many of the most influential women disappeared from the records entirely. Their downfall was the price of stepping into political spaces where they were not supposed to exist. And yet, despite all the risks, these networks survived for centuries. Why? Because armies needed them. Generals, kings, and diplomats, no matter how proud, relied on these informal channels to do the work they could not. They needed someone who could talk to an enemy's mother, wife, or daughter when official envoys would be detained or killed. They needed someone who could persuade a rival household to consider peace without losing face. They needed someone who understood the social maps of courts and families better than any military strategist. By the time the Renaissance arrived, these influence networks had grown so sophisticated that entire wars were shaped by the women beyond the curtains. The veil pushers who could orchestrate outcomes without ever appearing in the chronicles. They were not assassins. They were not seductresses. They were political manipulators with military reach, shaping history from the shadows of the rooms where men thought they ruled. The deeper you go into the history of these unseen operators, the more unsettling it becomes because you start realizing how many major geopolitical events, wars, alliances, betrayals were driven not by generals standing proudly on the battlefield, but by conversations no one recorded. To understand the true scale of the veil pushers, you need to look at the cases where their influence is strong enough that historians can still detect the outline of their work centuries later. These aren't myths or exaggerated legends. They are factual patterns embedded in diplomatic letters, court chronicles, tax records, marriage treaties, and the strange contradictions that appear when decisions shift too quickly to be explained by official accounts alone. One of the most striking examples comes from the ancient Near East. In Hittite diplomacy, peace treaties were always signed between kings, but they were almost always finalized by queens. The Hittite archives showed dozens of letters between royal wives, exchanging gifts, negotiating terms, calming tensions, even warning each other about military ambitions. These letters are shockingly direct. A queen would write to another queen saying, "Why has your husband grown angry? This can be resolved." Or, "The envoy who came from your land spoke too sharply. Has there been a misunderstanding?" These weren't polite notes. They were geopolitical stabilizers. Through these women, entire wars were prevented or delayed. One queen famously intervened during a hostage dispute, negotiating the release of a rival's brother by appealing to maternal compassion, a strategy male envoys never dared to use. Later, when the official treaty was drafted, not a single sentence credited her involvement. Her influence was real but invisible because it came through a channel historians didn't consider legitimate. If you travel several centuries ahead, you find a parallel in medieval Japan. Samurai chronicles describe the complex political systems of clan alliances, military obligations, and honor codes. But beneath the surface, thousands of decisions that shaped feudal warfare were influenced by noblewomen who managed clan marriages, wrote letters between feuding households, and served as intermediaries during hostage negotiations. One powerful example appears in the late Heian period when the Taira and Minamoto clans stood on the edge of annihilating each other. According to court diaries, the Empress Dowager arranged private meetings with women from both clans, exchanging poems and symbolic gifts that carried coded meanings. This soft diplomacy helped slow the escalation of violence long enough for temporary alliances to form, delaying full-scale war. Male officials dismissed these meetings as cultural gatherings, but the outcomes revealed their true purpose. For several months, troop movements were paused, negotiations reopened, and certain commanders shifted their stance. The Empress Dowager never appeared in military records, but her hand is unmistakable in the patterns of hesitation that saved thousands of lives. The Byzantine world offers another chilling case. Byzantine politics were famously brutal. Poisonings, blinding, secret executions, but some of the most sophisticated intelligence work in the empire came through elite women who controlled religious patronage. Because churches and monasteries were untouchable by soldiers, women who funded these institutions gained access to traveling monks, scribes, bishops, and scholars who carried information across the empire. A noblewoman named Anna Damascene, mother of Emperor Alexios I, became one of the most effective political operators of her era by managing these networks. She listened to monks who had traveled from the eastern borderlands, merchants who traded with the Turks, and noblewomen who married into rival families. Through her, military commanders often discovered internal threats before the formal intelligence system reported them. She manipulated marriages, alliances, and appointments to weaken rebel factions long before anyone suspected her involvement. Her actions shaped military strategy not by issuing orders, but by controlling the environment in which orders were created. She never claimed the title of general, but she orchestrated the removal of several generals who might have threatened her son's reign. Then you have the case of Amina of Zatsu, a West African leader whose story is often simplified into warrior legend. But historians studying Hausa oral traditions discovered something startling. Amina rarely engaged in direct battle herself. Her true genius was political manipulation. She secured power by controlling marriage alliances, manipulating rival chiefs through strategic gift-giving, and using her network of female traders who traveled between caravan routes and markets to gather intelligence on the movement of enemy forces. These traders could pass through territories without suspicion. Giving Amina real-time information about political intentions and trade agreements, her influence networks allowed her armies to strike precisely at the right moment. She built walls around cities not merely for defense, but as a psychological tactic to force rivals into negotiation. Male chroniclers later portrayed her as a warrior queen, but she was far more dangerous, a strategist who turned influence into a weapon more effective than any sword. What makes these stories so remarkable is not the women themselves, but the systems they built. Influence networks are not one-time actions. They are ecosystems. They involve knowledge of who can be pressured, who can be persuaded, who fears what, who desires what, who hates whom, who owes a favor, and who can be replaced. This knowledge is never written down. It is memorized, whispered, exchanged between family members, or embedded in rituals and customs. Women who managed these networks were less like informants and more like intelligence analysts, processing vast amounts of social data and translating it into strategic political moves. In medieval India, the Rajput courts offer a rare glimpse of these dynamics. Rajput women, especially those in the Zenana, were physically secluded but politically omnipresent. The Zenana became a hub of political negotiation because rival clans trusted women with communication more than they trusted male envoys. Queens and princesses carried messages between hostile houses through coded metaphors in songs and poems. They mediated disputes between generals, softened the anger of kings, and even influenced whether nobles supported or rejected alliances with the Mughals. One Rajput queen, whose name survives only in fragments, allegedly convinced her husband to withdraw troops from a suicidal campaign by presenting him with a symbolic gift that reminded him of a fallen ancestor. Her actions saved thousands of warriors, but chroniclers dismissed the event as the emotional plea of a wife. Modern analysis reveals it was part of a coordinated intervention by several women across the clan who feared catastrophic loss of life. They used emotional rhetoric not because they were emotional, but because emotional language was the only channel men permitted them to use. Across the Islamic world, women in royal harems wielded similar influence, not through seduction but through information. The harem was not a place of leisure. It was a political institution. Hundreds of women, wives, concubines, daughters, servants lived together, forming alliances that mapped onto the political structures outside. They spoke with ambassadors' wives, merchants, eunuchs who traveled between chambers, and scholars who taught princes. Through these conversations, they gathered intelligence and exchanged messages across regions. The mother of a caliph could negotiate directly with foreign rulers through private correspondence, bypassing the viziers who feared her influence. In one remarkable instance, during the Fatimid Caliphate, a vizier attempted to forge a treaty with a rival power. The caliph's mother intercepted the plan, warned the rival leader through a private envoy, and effectively sabotaged the treaty because it threatened her family's position. Her intervention altered the course of North African politics. but chroniclers only mention her in passing as a concerned noblewoman. That line, concerned noblewoman, is often the historical mask placed over a political strategist who outmaneuvered the empire's highest officials. In Europe, the Renaissance is celebrated as a time of intellectual explosion, but it was also an era of ruthless political maneuvering. And once again, women who had no legal authority shaped outcomes by controlling the flow of information. The Italian city-states offer some of the best documented cases. Families like the Medici and EST used marriages as diplomatic tools. But the women in these marriages were not passive. They became the conduit through which critical intelligence passed from one city-state to another. They corresponded with brothers, cousins, nephews, and mothers across Italy, describing tensions, rumors, military preparations, and personal rivalries. These letters were so sensitive that they were often written in coded metaphors, referencing paintings, seasonal harvests, or religious festivals to conceal political messages. One duchess used descriptions of the color of cloth arriving in the market to signal troop movements. Another used references to the ripeness of fruit to indicate whether negotiations were progressing or failing. These letters were not random. They formed the backbone of an informal intelligence network that shaped alliances in the Italian wars. The most shocking examples, however, come from the Ottoman Empire. The so-called Sultanate of women is often misunderstood as an era where harem women gained unusual power. But in reality, these women already possessed influence. The only difference is that the official records finally acknowledged it. Women like Harem Sultan, Keksem Sultan, and Turhan Sultan navigated political landscapes filled with assassins, grand viziers, janissary leaders, and foreign ambassadors. Their decisions affected military campaigns, succession struggles, and peace negotiations. They used charitable endowments, religious institutions, and marriage alliances to build political factions loyal to them. They pressured sultans to appoint or remove military commanders. They sponsored scholars who shaped the ideological climate of the empire. And they manipulated foreign ambassadors through carefully curated conversations that appeared harmless but carried strategic weight. These women operated in a world where a misplaced word could provoke a coup, yet they built influence networks that lasted decades. They were not anomalies. They were the most visible representatives of a system that existed long before them. All these stories build toward a single, undeniable conclusion. Whenever armies moved, someone behind the scenes created the conditions that made those movements possible. That someone was often a woman whose name no one bothered to write down. And the more you look, the more you see the outline of this invisible architecture. In diplomatic archives, you see sudden shifts that align suspiciously well with private family events. In chronicles, you see kings making abrupt decisions that contradict their previous plans, coinciding with the influence of a wife, mother, or sister. In tax records, you see unexpected exemptions granted to families connected to royal women. In letters, you see ambassadors mentioning private assurances or household conversations that clarified political intentions. These clues point to informal negotiations that took place outside official channels. But the most powerful insight is this: influence leaves fewer traces than action, and that is why these women are so difficult to study. Their power came from silence, from reading emotional landscapes, from knowing when to intervene subtly and when to retreat. They were not generals, they were not ministers, they were the architects of atmospheres. They shaped the psychological environment in which political decisions were made. They detected fear, ambition, jealousy, insecurity, loyalty, arrogance, and grief. All the emotional currents that drive human decision-making but never appear in military reports. They knew that a general who felt disrespected would refuse negotiation. They knew that a king who felt isolated would cling to bad advisors. They knew that a diplomat who felt misunderstood would sabotage a treaty, and they intervened accordingly. This is why modern intelligence agencies study influence operations with such seriousness. Hard power wins battles, but influence wins wars before they begin. And long before modern psychology, long before intelligence theory, long before espionage manuals, these women practiced it instinctively. They understood the social structure of their worlds better than any official. They knew where the fault lines were. They knew where pressure would yield results. And they knew how to shape events from the shadows, not because they wanted power, but because they had access to the spaces where power was formed. When you assemble all these pieces, the Hittite queens, the Japanese noblewomen, the Byzantine operators, the African strategists, the Middle Eastern intermediaries, the Italian correspondents, the Ottoman influencers, you don't just see isolated cases. You see an entire hidden infrastructure running parallel to the male-dominated world of politics and military affairs. And this infrastructure was often the deciding factor in wars, truces, alliances, and betrayals. The veil pushers were not anomalies. They were the missing half of political history. They were the intelligence system no one recorded, the stabilizers no one credited, the manipulators no one suspected, the power brokers no one admitted existed, because acknowledging them would dismantle the myth that men controlled everything. But now you know. Now you've seen the pattern. Now you've stepped behind the curtain into the world that shaped empires from the shadows. And if you made it through both parts of this story, then drop your thoughts in the comments, because I'm curious what part shocked you the most. If you're watching this on YouTube, like the video, share it, and subscribe. Because the more people who learn this buried side of history, the more complete our understanding of human power becomes.